and welcome to the Doofcast, the official variety podcast of doofmedia.com. My name is Scott Daly, and I am your host, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Matt Freeman. Matt, how's it going this week?
It's going well, Scott. I'm ready to begin communicating with you using words, using our spoken language, and communicating meaning back and forth to one another, but what is really going to be communicated? I don't know, and neither do you, and I don't remember how to talk anymore.
Oh my gosh, we just started and my head already hurts. This week on the show, if you can't crack Matt's expert hint, we're doing another one of our patron-produced episodes. For those of you that do not know, folks who pledge to us at the Do 4-year level or above on Patreon, that's patreon.com/doofmedia, get to select a movie or a short story for us to do a show on. This week, Patron Edan M asked us to take a look at a couple of the short stories from author Ted Chiang. We'll be discussing two stories today. The first one is Story of Your Life, which most people out there will know as the origin story for the movie Arrival, and then also a story called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feelings. So this is exciting, Matt. We've never done this before.
Yeah, we've never done a short story that I can recall. We've never done two short stories. And, you know, so first of all, Ted Chiang is awesome. The story of your life is the short story that the movie Arrival was based on. And he's just a really delightful short story writer. And I love that these two stories were picked because I had read Story of Your Life. I had never read Truth of Fact, Truth of Feeling. And you can see connections between these two stories, actually. So I'm glad we're going to get to talk about both of them.
Absolutely. I think I really appreciate Eden for, you know, it seemed like when he just gave me two stories, like that they were just random. But I think there was some intelligence behind the pick of these stories in particular. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to say. Not something we're experienced with talking about, but it should be a fun discussion. And then, of course, we're going to finish everything up with our usual jump back in to the trials and tribulations of the film industry, because new stuff is happening, Matt, and we've got to talk about it.
Sounds good.
But let's just jump straight into these stories. And before we talk about these stories in particular, I wanted to talk to you, Matt, because we've never done this before. I wanted to talk to you about short stories, just the concept of short storytelling to begin with, because again, this is something we've never covered on the show at all. We've never analyzed, critiqued, talked about short stories, and I just want to talk to you about, like, what do you like about short stories? Like, what is it about them as compared to like more long form storytelling like novels? Do you like them better? Like, what's your opinion on short stories? Yeah,
I definitely say they're one of my favorite mediums, just because they tend to be easier to consume sort of in their totality and understand and think about. And also, it just tends to be the case that the author of a short story has put in like more thought per unit word of the story, if that makes sense. Like they're denser.
Yeah,
the author has usually spent more time polishing each sentence of a short story than an author will have ever spent polishing every sentence of a novel, especially a long novel. And so that causes it to just be kind of a different mode. Like the prose in a short story generally is carrying a lot more information than the prose in a novel, for example.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I also just think, like, especially when you get into like genre stuff, I feel like there's so many less rules. Like, and there's so, like, I think short stories are a way to get away with stuff that you just couldn't get away with in a novel. Like certain choices of characterization, certain choices of character arcs, and where you are allowed to end the story. We all know that Stephen King is one of my favorite authors, and I love his long form storytelling. I really do. But when Stephen King is writing short stories, the problems with his endings that everyone accuses him of, and that I kind of disagree with, but that's a conversation for another time. But the problem with his endings kind of go away, because you can end short stories in ways that are inherently unsatisfying, and it's okay. And it's okay for a multitude of reasons, right? It's okay because the time investment is so much smaller, so you don't feel like you're getting ripped off. But it's just a different dynamic, and I feel like it has just different inherent rules to it.
Yeah, you don't necessarily come into a short story with an expectation that you're going to get a standard narrative. I mean, I think just the so-called writers and now do the right thing type formula where it's really, those are very short stories. Those are much shorter than these Ted Chiang stories we're going to talk about today. You sort of get a sense of the various kind of natural subgenres and subtypes of the short story when you look over those, because you'll see some that are a narrative, but you'll see some that are just kind of a feeling, a scene, a particular thought that is captured, and like you said, the ending is not a satisfying conclusion so much as a twist, perhaps, and then the story ends,
or a culmination of an idea, in a way that doesn't have to pay off in like a character arc narrative kind of way. I mean, one of the things I like so much about these two stories we're going to be talking about today is that it is just basically, it seems like Ted Chiang sat down with a central idea, and it's an idea that stretched out into a novel might not have landed with any kind of impact, but in this short, concise method really sells this whole idea, sells exactly what he's doing, the thematics he's working with. And obviously you can take these stories and turn them into like a feature length film or a full book or something. Like, I think Story of Your Life is a great example of that. I love Arrival, and I think we've done a whole show on Arrival, and we're probably going to have to talk about Arrival some more when we start talking about that story. But I mean, there is something absolutely unique in it, just taking the story about like, learning alien language and using that as a reflection of free will and how we perceive the universe. And you don't have like that story. There's one character, two, I guess. Like, there's other people in it, but they just don't matter. They just, it doesn't, we don't need background on any of the characters. The story jumps around in time by design, but like, it's not even in the flashbacks or forwards, I guess, to her daughter, but just like moments in the research. Like, we don't see the first time she sees the alien, we see it in person, but we don't see the first time she gets to the place. Like, all these things that the movie has to do, like to take you from point A to point B. The book, a short story, I feel like is just more free to just throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I guess we could start talking about the story now.
Sure.
Because that one thing that I noticed while reading it this time, and this is the second time I've read it and I've seen the movie, so I kind of understood what was going to be happening, is that like there is no actual frame of reference time. There is no, this is the present and we're looking back or we're looking forward. It's all just this, like, you could probably write some kind of paper on the way he uses tenses, because he's kind of like all over the place with tenses, but never in a way where it strikes you as being a contradiction. It's just like the, formulations like, I can remember you being 3, you will have been doing this. And it's like, wait a minute, will have been. I thought that was in the past.
Right.
And like you're continually sort of, it's kind of nagging at your consciousness that you're not quite sure when you are. And the truth is that you are not actually at any particular point in time. She's looking at all of this from this like floating perspective. Yeah, I
mean, I think the closest to a present that we have is the anchor point of where the story starts, which is
and where it ends.
Where it ends, which is her husband is about to ask her if she wants to have a kid. And I think I think you're absolutely right, because what the story does so well is it treats that as a future tense situation. Like, your father is about to ask me a question. Mm-hmm. And then we jump ahead a little bit and we see something like the request for that meeting was perhaps the second most momentous call in my life. And you're like, wait a minute, like what? Like suddenly you're talking about things that definitely have to happen after the moment where you've talked to her father, her kid's future father, about making her. And then suddenly and it doesn't hide that, because it says like right away, like, one of the first moments in the story, like on page 4 of the story, is you're going to die rock climbing. And I'm going to see your body, and that's going to happen. She'll be 25. We get all that right away, and we just don't understand. And I think one of the fun things about what this story does, and I think it's one of the things that the movie echoes perfectly, is this idea that it is doing all these things knowing that we as human beings put things linearly, like we can't help it. So like, and it's like doing it in a way where most people understand storytelling. Most people are like innately understanding of how storytelling works. So we're like automatically taking these moments and we're slotting them in a timeline, because that's just how our brain works. And so we're automatically doing this, and we're building a narrative. And in our narrative, it makes sense that, okay, well, this story must obviously be coming at like the very end of her life, and everything is in the past. But yeah, as you said, there are moments throughout that contradict that idea. The way tenses are used, the way she's talking, contradicts that general idea, and it doesn't throw you out of the story. But your brain, I think, maybe sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, like checks that. And it's like,
yeah. I mean, what's funny, what was really hilarious to me is that this short story, sitting down and reading it, just tricked me in the same way that the movie tricks you, even though I knew that was going to happen. so specifically what I mean is like, because okay, so my confession is,
should we set up the story? We always do this. We just dive right into it.
Yeah. I mean, sure.
I don't think anyone that's not read the story is going to get a lot out of this conversation.
Yeah. So this woman is a linguist. The actual timeline, I think this is kind of what I wanted to talk about anyway. Okay.
Sure.
The actual timeline is she's working as like a university professor linguist. She's unmarried and has no child, although you're tricked. I was yet again tricked about that. She gets basically a visit that says that aliens are here and we need to figure out how to talk to them. She goes, and when she goes to communicate with the aliens, she meets this physics professor who's kind of her opposite number, and they gradually learn the spoken and written languages of the aliens, and also their relationship develops. And told in tandem with this, sort of alternatingly, is stories of her relationship with her daughter, which you assume while reading is in her past.
Right.
But relative to the talking to the alien storyline, it's actually in her future.
Yeah.
And it's only toward the end of the story that you realize that the husband, with whom she's going to make her future daughter, who's going to die in a rock climbing accident, is the scientist who she's been working with.
Yep.
And then the aliens leave inexplicably. And the point, the sort of science fiction conceit is, by learning their language, she unhitches her consciousness, her awareness from cause and effect. And she gains this kind of this ability that the aliens are implied to also have, where they just sort of exist as entities beyond time almost.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Well summarized. So talk to me about what you were going to say before I rudely interrupted you.
Just the idea that I was yet again totally befuddled and tricked by the idea that the daughter stuff is actually in the future and not the past of the talking to the aliens timeline, despite the fact that that's exactly how the movie did it. I don't even know how that worked on me, but it's so cool to pay attention to how he does that, though, because he's not, it's just playing with the conventions of how stories are usually told.
Right.
That's all it is.
It is entirely manipulating your preconceived, just like almost innate understanding of how stories work. Because she is flashing back in between her research and learning the language. She's flashing back to her daughter, and you immediately are like, she's remembering these moments with her daughter. And she's really devastated in this, and her daughter's death still is this pale over her life that influences everything she does. And it manipulates you into that, and it's perfect. It really is. I love it so much.
Yeah. So one thing that I noticed while reading it was that there are 140 semicolons in this story.
Yes, there are.
The story's only 39 pages, I believe.
Mm-hmm. That's 39. A whole lot of semicolons.
So that's a huge amount of semicolons, and we did check. He does like his semicolons just in general. There's also a lot of semicolons in Truth of Fact, Truth of Feeling, but not. There's about half as many. So this is a very unusual amount of semicolons. And the fun thing was, my perception is that the number of semicolons gradually increases throughout the story, and many of the semicolons occur during when people are speaking. And I think my favorite kind of the key to my theory as to why he does this in the story is the part when they're talking about, I forget if it's the principle of least action or if it's time reversibility or if both of those things are discussed close to each other. But in either case, it's when her and her physicist's future husband are talking about these concepts of physics. They use semicolons to separate the clauses of their speech, and in almost every case, you could swap the order of the clauses, and the sentence would still be totally intelligible and mean the same thing.
Yeah, I did not catch that, but the second you said that, I dove back into the story and frantically started reading, and yes, 100%. And that it must be intentional, right? Because I mean, one of the big things about the heptapods, which are the aliens, and the way they communicate is that because they perceive all times at once, the order of construct of their sentence is immaterial. It just is whatever they feel like it. And that is something that, originally, as she's trying to learn the language, really frustrates Luis because it's different from how we do it, right? The order that we're speaking right now matters. We're constructing the sentence as we're going, and the order we're saying it in is important to the meaning of the sentence. But that is not the same for the heptapods, and he's constructed language in this story that is as close as the human language can get to that idea as possible. And that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I was blown away because I was like, it made me think. It kind of makes you pause and think, like, how many times how often do I speak that way, where you could rearrange the clauses in a sentence and the message would be the same. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because these ideas kind of feed into the second story we're going to talk about too, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
It just makes you pay attention to the relationship between thinking and talking. That's something he draws explicit attention to later when he talks about how Luis, the character, always thought in language, some language, whether it be English or Russian, but when she thinks in heptapod, she doesn't like think through things. She just sort of like exists with the heptapod image for a period of time and then moves on. Which is like a whole different mode of thinking where, and she talks about the idea of like some people thinking in American Sign Language, which, it's impossible for me to really imagine because I don't know that language.
Yeah.
Yeah, like just these ideas of how much the way you speak and the influences the way you think is an awesome idea.
And I think that absolutely is going to tie into the next story as well. I think the idea of language, especially written and spoken language, and how it wires our brain is something that Chiang seems obviously very fascinated in. And it is inherently interesting. I think we should say here that if there was anything that was more your shit than these stories, I would be very surprised to see it. But I think, and that's not to say that I don't like it too. I love both of these stories. I think they're very well told and fascinating. And even the sciencey stuff that I don't understand as much, I think Chiang does a really good job of getting you interested in it. But this is exactly your lane, right? This is the type of narrative that you love. The things that it's exploring, the themes that it's exploring, and the methods in which it does that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fun about this, or just an interesting fact about it maybe, is that he probably could have told the story without any reference to the principle of least action or the description of the way water, the way light behaves in water and all that.
Yeah.
That was just kind of an extra way to say, like, this is maybe the impetus of the idea behind this. Or this is kind of the physical justification of how this might really happen. But even setting aside the idea that like physics is weird, which it totally is, there's this idea that like the way you think is totally dictated by the language, and just the idea that maybe people, maybe there is some entity that could, like, their basis of thinking and their whole language could be based in it's kind of a different view on physics itself. I find that fascinating. And yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that all that stuff made sense to me. I don't understand how the light can know where it's going before it gets there. Does that hurt? I don't get it, but
I only sort of understand it, and the weird thing is like you're not understanding it because you are getting it wrong. You're not understanding it because it's exactly as weird and nonsense as it sounds like it is. Like basically like there in order to solve these equations, you have to basically do an integral over every possible path that the light could take. And then the one that it takes is the minimum path. Like that's literally the way you solve the problem. And it's like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. And that's,
So we have not figured out why it's doing this. We just know that light does this.
I mean, I'm not actually a physicist, so I don't know if there's like a better way, like maybe there's some other way of writing it down where it's like, look, numbskull, like if you think about it this way, then it makes more sense. But, yeah, I was told by a physicist that is a pretty realist, like that's actually what's going on, and it's weird. It is genuinely weird. So
yeah, I think the important thing here, and I think the reason that Ted Chiang is a pretty good master of this is that it doesn't matter that I don't get it, right? I mean, like it is merely a metaphor to help explain kind of the otherworldly, nonsensical nature of the fact that, hey, they like this weirdness, this weird quirk of light. Their language exists in a place where it does some weird quirk of mental thought of the idea of consciousness and yes, it's science fiction. Yes, that probably doesn't exist, but maybe, I don't know. But it allows you to reinforce the idea, and I think like the thing it specifically does in the movement of the story is the idea of I forgot what the principle was called, but it allows Louise to get to the thought process that helps her solve what's going on. And so like, it's like, not only is it just a fun, another example of weirdness in the world we live in, but it serves narrative purpose just to get our character thinking along a weird, timey-wimey shit kind of frame of reference.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. Like it's more a mode of storytelling than it is like there are some science fiction writers, even ones that I really like, where they're basically just trying to find an excuse to talk about a cool science thing. And this is not really that. This is more like a cool human thing that he has found a science hook for.
Right. Because we kind of haven't really dove into the real human side of this, but the humanity of the story is she's a woman who is going to create a child that she knows will die on her 25th birthday, or not on her 25th birthday, but at 25. She knows she's going to die. And I actually, if I had one complaint about the book, it's that I think the movie sells the emotion of that decision a little bit better. I think like the conceit of the film is kind of the emotion of choosing yes to the question, are you going to or do you want to make a baby? Despite knowing everything that's going to happen. I think the movie's more interested in that than the book is. I think, but at that point in the book, like it had kind of firmly established that just even the knowledge of this information doesn't make you change the future. Like it's just, you don't have that desire.
I agree. I liked, I mean, the movie doesn't say any of this out loud, but it gives you this feeling that she recognizes that she would never choose not to have the child, even though she's going to suffer terribly, because then that would mean that she never got to have the child at all.
Right.
Which would be worse.
25 years of some of the greatest love you could ever imagine is still worth it, despite knowing the heartbreak and pain after it. And I think one of the things that the movie does really well, and I don't want to just focus on the movie, it's one of my favorite movies, so I'm going to try not to focus on it, but the movie shows us that the reason they divorce, the Gary and Louise, is because he finds out that she knew and did it anyway, and that's not something he can deal with. Right. And I think I like that a lot because it shows kind of the power and the responsibility and this gift that she was given. But I mean, this is not to say that the way it's done in the story is worse. It's different. I think it summoned emotions in the movie in me in certain ways. And in the book, I think it summoned more fascination because we're going to talk about free will now, Matt, which I know is like your favorite subject. But this story basically ends up staring the concept of free will in the face and trying to crack it, because it's this. I love the metaphor it used, which is like the book of life, I guess it was, where if you're able to read the book, couldn't you decide not to do that thing? And well, if you do, then how could it be in the book anymore? And
the book wouldn't have said that. And
right. This general paradox there. And what this story posits is, it's like, no, like you will choose to live the life your exact same way anyway. Whether it's, I think it describes it as like a compulsion. It's, what is it? I forget the word he uses. The specific word he uses in like describe, like when she's at the supermarket and sees the salad bowl and she's just like, I have to get the salad bowl. I forgot which word she uses, but it's really interesting. This idea that like, despite knowing you will be compelled to act the same way anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because she's specifically getting the salad bowl that she knows is going to whack her kid in the head and have to take her to the hospital. Right. And she does it anyway. Like I'm not going to, like, that's the thing. I wouldn't say that I like the way the movie does it more or anything like that. I think it's more like, this is the idea, is that once you become privy to the future, that is your future. This isn't a superpower. It's not a curse either, because it's not like she feels trapped in it. It's just, it's no more a trap than like the fact that we are writing this one particular moment that passes forward in time as a trap.
Sure.
And we can't go back like that. I mean, it kind of is, but we don't feel trapped by it because it's just our world. It's our reality. It's how we're made. And I like the idea. It kind of pushes you into a fun, like, this is one fun thing about science fiction is it pushes you into this place where you're like, well, if you did just see your whole life all at a glance, and you were just sort of aware, there wasn't even a moment in time per se. It's just a kind of 4-dimensional object. Then it would actually, then like, how would it feel to think about time as being this one point that just moves linearly forward? Like that would feel weird and stifling.
Yeah, it sure would. Yeah. It's a
fun, place to put your mind in.
Mm-hmm. So I got to the part in the story. Okay. She describes taking the bowl as it seemed just as urgent as my rushing to catch the bowl when it falls on you, an instinct that I felt right in following. So yeah, I mean, like, it's so funny that like, even my brain, as Luis is explaining how this process works, like, wants to put it in the frame of reference of my linear understanding. Like, she's talking later in the book about how like her and one of the other people that have learned heptapod B are like communicating, and they're fully aware that this is completely performative communication. Like, they all know how this is going to end, but they have to say the words anyway because saying it has action to it. I think that's a fun little tidbit, but like, she's talking very like indifferently about how, oh, I was reacting in my way, I was playing my part, and like in the back of my head, I wanted to be like, well, what if you're just not very good at acting? And I was like, wait, and I had to stop myself and be like, no, that's not what it means. Like, that's not like that's the way to interpret it in our language, right? That like, she knows what she's about to say, but she says it anyway. Like, it comes off as just a performance, but that's not really what it means in context. It's going to happen. You're going to react in the exact same way that you always would have reacted in. You're just aware of it.
Yeah. I don't know if this will be a helpful way of looking at it or not, but like, you can write down the equation for like a ball being thrown through the air and landing somewhere in kind of the human way, if you will, in terms of like velocity and acceleration and derivatives of time, or you can write it down in the heptapod way in terms of action, which is a kind of, as is described in the story, like a much more abstract principle that has to do with the destiny of the ball, if you will. But both ways of writing it down are going to give you exactly the same answer. It's like, just because you wrote it using action doesn't mean that the ball ever had any choice, right?
Right.
And I think we are the same.
We're the ball, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're the ball, regardless of which way you choose to write down the equations.
Right. Because I mean, again, and there's another moment where I just constantly, this is what I think is a symptom of the good writing, where I feel like this is one of those things where it's by design, where your brain falls into these traps over and over again. Like, again, when she's talking about the heptapods, and she's like talking about how funny it is that they went through this whole rigmarole, like where they pretended that they couldn't understand us. And I was like, wow, that's really silly to go through all that. And it's like, no, that's not like, they're not like actively saying, oh, I'm just going to play along. Like, that's not what it means. That's not what the experience is. But like, I put it in my linear time brain, and that's what it comes out as.
Yeah.
And I think he knows that too. Like, I think he's writing it that way to challenge you. And then like, I think the ways in which he goes back to reconfirm these ideas over and over again, to really beat it into your brain, to get you thinking a little bit differently, through both like literal, just the in and outs of the story, but as you pointed out, like structural technique, is just wonderful. It's really great.
Yeah, right. It definitely, it's the thing where he has this particular thesis that he wants to communicate, and every element of this short story is geared toward communicating that thesis. And that's, everything from who the character is and how she thinks and how she is, how she communicates, what her personal relationships are, what her backstory is, the choices she makes, the story that's actually being told, and of course the science fiction conceit, which he then kind of explains to you in like 4 or 5 different ways, although it never really becomes repetitive or boring, because it's always like a slightly different kind of look at it. Because I mean, fundamentally, he's explaining the same concept with the heptapod language that he's explaining with all of the principle of least action stuff. It's the same thing. He's just trying to get it through everybody's thick skull. And eventually, I think it clicks with most people. That's an interesting. Maybe we can talk about that for a second. Like I think that a lot of people don't interpret this story the same way necessarily. Like, my recollection of this story, like some people don't actually think that she has like time vision. I don't know. I can't speak to what other people think, but I remember reading about like people disagreeing about what the story actually means.
That's fascinating to me. I haven't read anything about the story. I remember people had a really tough time with the movie and how the movie was like doing its time stuff. Like with the movie messes with this a little bit more, because like she gets the phone number of the Chinese president or general, like by talking to him in the future, and people are like, well, wait, how would that work? Like, people want to put linear time on top of it, but so is it something similar to that, or?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. See, the thing is, now I can't see it any other way than the way I see it now, which is sort of a very Ted Chiang thing to admit.
Sure.
I mean, she sort of does that in this story too, because there's even the small moment where she sort of remembers the idea of a non-zero sum game by like hopping into the past and then back into the future.
Right. And I love that, because it can both be seen and read as completely straightforward, which is that she remembered it at the same time because we saw the moment in the past/future where she heard it the first time. But it could also just be like, I think that doesn't play the story's hand completely yet. I think there's still like some twists and turns before that. Like, you don't read that part and be like, oh, she's experiencing all these things simultaneously. It's a fun way to tip your hand, and I think the movie uses that scene like almost literally the same way, right? And that's in the movie the first time when you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
It's a really great wait, what moment, but it doesn't like show your entire hand yet.
Well, yeah, and I think that's actually pretty critical. And I honestly don't think that he would have put something like that in this story, because it would violate causal physics if information from the future influenced the past. And so actually at no point in this story does information from the future influence the past. It's she's aware of it, but she can't act on it. So yeah, that's really the difference between this and the movie. In the movie, explicitly, she has superpowers, She does not have superpowers in this book, in this story, because she can't actually change the past.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that's true. I guess technically there was no way past Luis could have gotten the phone number of the Chinese general without the help of future Luis. Future Luis.
Yeah.
So I guess that's true. I mean, I think the movie posits it as like, I just exist in all these things at the same time. So there is no future and past. It's literally all happening at the same time. And all that's irrelevant. Whereas I think the book makes it clear that she is not full heptapod consciousness, right? Like her brain was wired with our way of thinking. And so at most she gets like bits and pieces at times, and is kind of unmoored from the linearity of time, but not completely.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a question that I don't know how to answer. Would be like, just because the heptapods see things in terms of action, like the way I see it is, even though the heptapods see things in terms of action, they are still just as much like embedded in a causal physics framework. Okay, so I'm viewing it in terms of causal, thinking in terms of like, you throw a ball and the ball flies through the air and blah blah blah, the way a human sees it, versus action, where the ball's being thrown and its flight path are like immutable facts about time and shit like that. So in either case the same thing happens. So I would say I don't think the heptapods have like superpowers. I think they just have a very, very different kind of awareness. I don't know. See, that's the thing, is I don't know if it's quite coherent in a science sense, and I'm kind of okay with that, because that I much more enjoy that I'm like, people have pointed out that like the idea, like the core conceit of blindsight actually kind of is just really unlikely, and I'm like, yeah, I don't care though. Like that, it's still mind blowing to me.
Sure, it's still a story, right? At the end of the day, it's a story.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess the one last thing I wanted to talk about is, we've been talking about Arrival a lot, but I wanted to talk about how you take a short story like this and adapt it. Because one of the big changes, for the most part, I think the themes and the tone of the story is pretty much the same. But one of the big changes they do is add conflict to it in a way that the short story does not really have any conflict, right? I mean, like, there are stressors and tense moments as she's trying to figure stuff out, but there's no antagonist in the story. There's nothing. It's just this examination of a woman and this thing she went through. Whereas the movie, understandably, you got to add that stuff. And I think the movie actually does a really beautiful job of adding tension to the story in a way that doesn't feel tacked on, feels a very natural extension of what they're doing, which is just tapping into some of the innate conflict of human nature.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because it reminded me of the first time I read the story, which was years ago. I think it was in like a short story anthology when it originally came out, and I was actually super distracted because it starts off on this note of like, this woman's daughter is going to die, and it's super depressing. And then we go into this story about what you think is her past, or well, it doesn't really matter what you think it is. The point is, you're like, okay, when are we going to get back to the when the daughter dies part? Because that's going to be so sad when we get there. Because that's how we're kind of used to stories being told. Like,
sure.
We're building up in a particular way to this moment, and that's not at all what the story is doing. And so when I read it, I was just like so thrown off, and I think intentionally so, but almost thrown off to a degree where I like missed a lot of what was actually going on in the story, and didn't really understand it at that time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think you're totally right. I think what the story does is, whenever you say, and then this is going to all end in your death, whenever a story does that, you make the assumption that, okay, so we're going to flash back and then lead up to that moment.
Right.
And that's where the direction the story's going. And you're absolutely right that it completely says nope to that and just does something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, like, you're expecting a certain emotional thrust to it, and then there's like the moment when she's thinking to herself, like, it was probably my little moments of overprotectiveness that drove you to be a risk-seeking person, resulting in your death. And it's a very like clinical way of saying that, right? Like she's just sort of like making this observation very passively. And it's like, man, like if it were a normal point of view, that would be like horribly sad realization. Like, oh, I was responsible for my child's death through overprotectiveness. But it's almost like the concept of responsible has lost all meaning to her at this point.
Yeah. Which, I mean, you would think it's like callous and indifferent, but it's just not. That's not the way it works. It's just like
I think that the reason it doesn't come off as callous and indifferent in the final analysis is because like she's sort of constantly swimming in her life with her daughter.
Yeah.
At all times, because that's always just as present to her as I mean, there is no present moment, I guess you could say. So her daughter, in a sense, isn't really gone.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good spot to end it and switch over to the other story we have to talk about. So we're going to take this concept of memories, and then we're going to really inspect that with Ted Chiang's next story, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling.
Yeah.
So
memories and language, definitely.
Yeah. So talk to me. What is the summary of this one?
So this is yet again we're playing some structural games. So there's essentially two intertwining stories. The framing device is that this whole thing is a piece being written by our narrator.
A journalist,
a journalist, yeah, and he's supposed to be writing a piece about this new memory augmentation technology, which is called ReMem or something like that.
Yeah, ReMem, yeah.
And it's the sort of thing you might find in like Wired or whatever, where like it's very thinky. But it jumps back and forth between him writing this article about the impact of technology on our lives, a lot of which is sci-fi. It's like near future sci-fi, and the other story being the story of a young boy in some tribal context. I'm not sure if we're meant to actually know where or when exactly, but
yeah,
basically, if you know something about that, go ahead.
I don't. I mean, it's called Tivland, but all they say is they're people they're European. So, I mean, you could make the assumption that it's an African tribe, but it doesn't have to be.
I think I probably made that assumption. Yeah. And then there's a European missionary who comes, teaches the boy to read and write. And then this is all wrapped up in the end, as you kind of realize that like this story about the teaching the people how to read and write is actually a metaphor for how reading and writing changes the way we think in really fundamental ways, and then making a comparison between that and this new technology where it's like memory augmentation, and that's going to change the way that we think too.
Yeah. So what'd you think of this one? I don't think either of us had read this one, where we both had read the previous one before.
I had not read this one. I found it delightful. This is I think this is shorter than the other one.
Yeah, it's a little bit shorter. Yeah,
but I mean, it hits a lot of the same ideas, right? Like this idea that I like one of the most direct ideas for me actually was that the concept of a word in Story of Your Life, she specifically says nobody had ever come up with a satisfactory definition for what a word was in human languages.
Right.
And then here in this story, they point out like he's like, put spaces between your words. The missionary says, put spaces between your words. And he's like, what are words? He's like,
right.
And then only after he sort of learns how to put spaces between words does he actually understand what words are.
Yeah.
Because we don't like before you learn how to write, you're just kind of like opening your mouth and making sounds to convey meaning. Like you don't break your speech down into grammar consciously. You just do it automatically.
Right. I think my favorite part of that was when he was frustrated at the fact that a multisyllable word clearly has pauses in it, but it is still one word for some arbitrary reason. I love. That's one of my favorite things about the story is just the way in which Chiang explores just things that we take for granted, like fundamental truths of our lives that we take for granted, and he manages to explore them from the perspective of a person that had never seen it before. And I just find that inherently fascinating. Like, how do you get in that mindset, right? Like at the very beginning when he's talking to the kid's talking to Mosby, the I forgot the word.
Missionary.
The missionary. Thank you. He's like just explaining the basics of what writing is. And he asks him, how can paper tell a story? It's an art that we Europeans know. When a man speaks, we make marks on paper. When another man looks at the paper later, he sees the marks and knows what the sounds the first man made. In that way, the second man can hear what the first man said. And I'm like, I've never heard writing described that way before. Like, It's fascinating, like, to come up with that idea. I love it.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of a story John Green told about refusing to learn the alphabet until someone explained to him what it was for. I love that aspect. Like he really is kind of asking questions of the things that we take for granted. Mm-hmm. And that's really fun. Yeah. That's super fun.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked about this is it set itself up very similar to like a Black Mirror episode where you've got the concept of this remem thing and he's exploring like all and I literally actually think this is a Black Mirror episode where people just record everything that they experience. And one of the things we see is the way people will use it is they will, in fights and marriages, they will go back and nitpick every little moment of their fight to prove who was right and who was wrong, who said what and who didn't. And it really seems like it's just going to be, like, especially from the beginning, it really seems like it's just going to be this examination of the horror of this kind of technology. And I think a lot of that has to do with the point of view of the writer that we're seeing here, which I know you wanted to talk about. But it shifts from that, right? It like the end of the story, it does not have a, oh, you better watch out kind of warning. It has a, hey, I don't know if there's any good answers to a lot of these questions we're positing.
Yeah, like it probably will change the way we think, but so did writing, and I think writing is great. So
like throughout the history of our existence, these new language tools we have invented have fundamentally changed the way which we experience the world. And yes, we've probably lost some stuff in that, but there's also ways in which it really benefits us so we can become better people. I love that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the point of view.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So for all of our years of podcasting, Scott, I've always been in the position of wanting, of sort of automatically empathizing with the protagonist to the point where other people will tell me that I'm being too soft on them.
That doesn't sound like us.
Well, in this case, I had like this. I was like rolling my eyes at this protagonist like toward the beginning, and I was like, "That's interesting. Why?" I just have like a negative impression of this protagonist, and I did the thing where I was like, "I wonder if I'm supposed to feel that way," and then of course I was like, "Well, I'm going to assume that I was. I'm going to assume that this was an intentional authorial construction that he's giving me things to latch onto and to note as being incongruous or to stick out." And then I was very gratified because it turned out that those things were like exactly what I was supposed to be paying attention to, and I was very happy. But the stuff like so some of it would, though, I don't know if I'm like right about though. So like, for example, the point where he's talking about the idea of like, wouldn't it be bad if your spouse could find the example of when they were right and you were wrong? And I was like, why would that be bad? You just admit that you're wrong. But there were several things like this where he would come up with like his objection to the technology would be something I would be like, yeah, I guess that would be a problem if you're like a baby, but like just like why would it be bad to know what actually happened? Like the problem is definitely if you're in the kind of relationship, for example, where everybody's constantly going to be mining the videos to try to get the other person, and like that's the problem with the relationship. It's not
Right.
the fact that you have this video.
Yeah.
And that just seemed really obvious to me, and I was like, what's this guy's problem? And then that was the moral, basically.
Yeah, I that's fascinating to me because I was definitely not annoyed with this character in the way that you were. I definitely can see that after the fact. And my only excuse, I guess we'll call it, for that is I was really tapped into the Black Mirror of it all. And so I was really reading this as just like, yeah, this is just as dire and terrible as possible. But I mean, one of the things that I think Chiang does that's so smart is bring this spokesperson, Erica Myers, in. And I think there's like an intentional, because it's a spokeswoman from the company, there's an intentional dismissal of opinion there, just because it's like, oh, you're just trying to sell your product. But she's 100% right in everything that she's saying.
Right.
But it is really fascinating how he kind of manipulates your emotions there. Because I mean, like he goes on this big long argument of how like some people's marriages survive on ignorance. And I was like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah. Huh.
Is that a good thing? Are we saying that's good? Cause I don't know about that. But yeah.
I mean, it's really because okay, this is all very subtle and complicated, but I think maybe we can tease it out if we try. So like he makes a statement like that, like some people's marriages survive on on forgetfulness.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a statement that on its face just reads as laughable. You're like, okay, like that sounds miserable. If that's like the basis of your life, like that's sad. And then basically the big twist of the story, let's spoil the big twist, because I kind of skipped over that. That was probably more central than all that other stuff I talked about. But the central kind of emotional core of the story is his relationship with his daughter. Once again, we have a parent-daughter relationship.
Yeah.
And this is another thing that actually annoyed me about him as a character is that he like would be like mad at her and would like whine about how their relationship was strained. And from my perspective as a parent, I'm just like, why are you letting the fact that she was mean to you one time influence you at all? Like, she's your child. You're just supposed to forgive her for that kind of thing.
Yeah. So the event in this story is his wife leaves him and his daughter to go gallivant around the country. Although I'm wondering if there's more to that than we're told in the story. But and so he says when his daughter is 16, I think she was 16 years old, she storms out of the house and says like, it's your fault. You're the reason she left. And then storms out. And he says like, oh, that was a moment where like it really completely broke the relationship with my daughter. And it took me 6 years to get back to a good place with her, and I'm really proud of myself for getting there. And I think you're absolutely right that like from the perspective of a parent, it's got to be like,
the hell's wrong with you?
She's a kid, man.
Yeah,
like
right.
you gotta get over that. She's a kid dealing with her mother leaving. Like she's gonna say some shit that she doesn't really mean. But yeah, the big reveal is 100 million times worse, that he, the adult, is the one that said that to his child.
And then he revisionist historied it so that he could feel good about himself.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, this starts to get into what I think it's one of the most fascinating things about this is how memory is so influenced by the narratives that we tell ourselves, how we are all the protagonist of our story. And so everything we remember is going to put us in the most positive light possible. And so the remem system then is a way to put facts above feelings, right? That's the title, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling. This idea that both are true because one is true to you, but one is empirically true. Which one is more important? We have this not ancient, but this civilization untouched by the concept of writing, in which they value true to me just as much as empirically true, if not more. And how language and writing and facts and recording and these things change that, and how that same process is happening in the future with the digification of memories.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really interesting to think about, because a huge amount of what we do in our brain is come up with like a satisfying narrative for how we're the good guy, right?
Sure.
Like this is something I think about and talk about a lot, and we even talk about it in other in other storytelling things, and it's a big storytelling idea. This concept of like the fact that we're all the hero of our own story, and that's actually pretty fundamental to how the human social animal works. There have even been people who say like the whole purpose of consciousness is to be the press secretary for the brain. That the brain is self-serving and utterly selfish, and then we have like this module that sits on top of it and says like, all right, how do we tell a story where what we just did was actually the right thing to do and not just the selfish thing to do? Because everybody's gonna be mad at us if they think that we did it for selfish reasons. Depends. I don't know whether that's exactly true or not, but regardless, definitely the instinct to feel good about yourself is powerful, and this is cool because the idea that we could have like these perfect records of everything that we said is like a true science fiction possibility, actually. Like
yeah. I think this is 100% possible. Like within our lifetimes, it could happen. Like we're already recording more and more of our lives generally.
There was one point within the recent past where like I was like looking back over old like Discord chat records and was like, huh. Is that how I came off? like, cause with distance between then and now, you're able to read your own words as if they're not yours. And you're like, okay, I can better understand this whole situation now that I am not actually in it. And
right.
But like if I hadn't gone back and looked at it, I would have just had the nice pat little narrative that I had in my head.
Sure.
Not that most people do or necessarily should be going back and like rereading things that they said before, but that capability already exists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the question that the story kind of asks, right? Is should we? Because like, I don't know, like not to get too personal, but I was in a very serious relationship that ended very suddenly because of the other person. And I have definitely over the course of the past 8 years of my life narrativized the shit out of that in a way that probably makes me look completely innocent and her be the one responsible for everything. And one of the things that I thought about while reading the story was, that's probably not all true, is it? Right? I was probably responsible, just as responsible for that, And so the question is like, the idea of that can make you a better person, right? I think that's what we see in the story. We see that our narrator here is on the path to becoming a better person via the use of this tool because he's allowed to go back and see those moments. But he also posits, like, I think the idea that that you should want to, like, that forgetfulness should be good is bad. I agree with that. But I do think the idea that part of forgiveness is being able to distance yourself from the feeling of pain is something that's very true. And if you had the ability to perfectly recall the moment of like heartbreak or the moment of hurt or whatever, anytime you wanted to, I think that would make it definitely more difficult to get to a point of getting over it, a point of forgiveness, a point of moving on. Because I know myself, and I know I would have pulled up that memory many, many times over the months after, like, so I have a hard time disagreeing with that sentiment either.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I don't think I want to disagree with it, but I would just like while we're having personal private stories hour, I definitely in situations like what you're describing, like some kind of terrible breakup, I have no problem retaining perfectly veridical brain memories to torture myself with. I don't need exogenous computer memory. Like I will gladly torture myself with actual memories forever, until eventually years later they just cease to have any emotional meaning, like,
yeah, but what if you could relive it perfectly?
I think, well, and that's the thing is I don't know, but I have a feeling that if you could relive it perfectly, you would just desensitize to it eventually.
That is very possible.
It's also possible that the opposite would happen and you would like hypersensitize and just like destroy you. So I don't know. It is interesting to think about though.
And I mean, and a counter argument to this, I think, would be just like any other bad idea that exists post breakup, you should just not do that. Like there's already plenty of ways in which we could make that kind of situation a billion times worse on ourselves. Like
by inventing Facebook, for example.
Yes, exactly. So I think those things already exist, technology or not, they already exist. Like I think you're right. Just like the way your brain works. Like I think a lot of people, when they're going through these kind of things, need to make active choices in their head to move their thoughts away from those kind of negative thoughts. And so you would have to do it with this remem thing too, except the choice would be don't call up that memory over and over again. So yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Sure.
One thing that I wish he had kind of given a more Ted Chiang-y investigation is the idea that like a memory is not a video clip. And I don't know, maybe my brain works differently than other people, but like a memory for me will have a visual component, but like it's always very clear to me that I am constructing a thing in my brain that is it's somewhere between a simulation and an imagination. It's not a video clip though. It's not a like it doesn't store information that isn't pertinent to the memory. For example, like I don't remember what shirt people were wearing unless that was super important to the memory. So I don't know. I don't think it's a nitpick necessarily, but like I do think it's important because like so for example, like in a memory you might remember how you were feeling or how you were thinking or okay, let's just stick to how you were feeling in a given memory. You'll remember not only what was happening, but how you were feeling. But in this remem thing, you're only seeing what you saw.
True.
You're not remembering how you felt. So it's not really a memory.
No, it's not. But wouldn't that like every time you watch it, you would create a new memory of experiencing it again? I don't know. I think we're getting too far into the weeds on this one, but
probably it just struck me as something where I was like, it was a thing I thought about while I was reading it. So, but yeah, I don't have like a conclusion on that one for sure.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I felt like I'm not sure what the final moral of Jijingi's story was. The idea where basically his clan elder is like, look, it doesn't really matter whether our ancestor was part of that tribe or this tribe. What matters is like the bonds of kinship that we have now, and you're being all weird and European on me by trying to make it out to be like it actually matters what actually happened 100 years ago. And then Jijingi is like, oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I should never have done that. And it's like, well, isn't that kind of the opposite? Like I don't have a dog in the fight of what tribe they should ally with. It's more like doesn't that contradict the moral that he was trying to make with the overall story? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does, and I think it doesn't. I think what it leaves you at is this ambiguity, right? Where like he admits that writing, I mean, they lost something of themselves, sure. I just that really sold the shrug of an answer to me, which again I think is a benefit of short stories. Where if this was a full novel and the conclusion of the novel was, yeah,
right,
I would be like, well, that's fucked up. But because it took me like 30 minutes to read, just this idea of like, I'm not sure what the right answer is here. I am less adamant that this is bad than I was before, but I also recognize the ways in which this can be very beneficial and good, but I also recognize the ways in which this could be bad. Also, I think I'm reading this book like with Arrival or The Story of Your Life, where we're reading it from the perspective of a person whose brain works linearly. In this, we are reading this from the perspective of a person who does indeed value empirical written down evidence over thoughts. Like that's just the way we're wired. So like I read the conclusion of the village story as as kind of a failure when they're just like, yes, I'm going to destroy the evidence and we're going to hide the truth. And, but that's just the way I'm wired, right? Like that's just a result of our existence.
Yeah. And we're porting in these ideas about like our legal system, while like it really does seem like in their culture, it's really more about like what's best for everyone.
Sure.
And what's best for everyone doesn't line up with what the historical record says, then really just ignore it. Like it's just the right thing to do is ignore the historical record probably. So, I mean, I didn't have like a moral objection to it. I was just like, well, doesn't that contradict? But I do like, I take your point that it's like, it kind of does contradict, but that's because humans are contradictory.
Yeah, right. So one thing I wanted to ask you, it's like, again, we get this perspective of this guy that annoyed you, and then we learn that he's like kind of the self-absorbed asshole who really, really hurt his daughter, never really apologized for it. The only reason they did reconcile at the end is because she sought out professional help and got to a place herself. And we kind of end the story on this idea of like, I'm putting all this out there for you. Like, I think he says he gives up on writing the article, right? Like he was writing an article to review this remem thing, and he gave that to someone else because instead he's writing this other piece that's all about him.
Yeah.
Like, so there's this kind of like double layer here where I'm like, he's this guy that's really self-absorbed and it's all about him. And then he kind of did it again a little bit. I don't know. Is there anything to that?
I think there is. I think that there's actually a decent read where this character is just a horrible monster. Like, I don't know. Like, I think it can't be, coincidence, obviously, that the last line of the story is, and if you think I've been less than honest, tell me. I want to know. Because my first thought is, no, you don't. Mm-hmm. You don't want to know because you're the kind of person who has systematically hidden this stuff from yourself. And you got caught.
Yeah, right.
And because you got caught, now you can't help but face what you did and try to get around it. But like I even like another great moment to me was when she starts to rail at him and he's like, I started to get defensive, and I'm like, see?
Yeah.
like you're still being defensive even though you're completely in the wrong, and there's like there's no other way here other than like you came to apologize to her and she didn't accept your apology instantly, and now you're getting defensive about it. Like you sir need to reevaluate your life, and I guess that's what you're doing, but also you're writing a super long article where you are cheering yourself for doing so.
Yeah,
so.
And I mean, like the Nicole section ends with her saying, "Let's be clear, you don't come running to me every time you feel guilty over treating me like crap. I worked hard to put this behind me, and I'm not going to relive it just so you can feel better about yourself." And she's pretty clear there. And then we see at the end of the article that Nicole has started using Remem too, and realizing that her picture of everything wasn't quite as clear, and that softened her up. And then at the end, he says, "I'm releasing my life, whatever it was called, my life log to all of you so you can look for yourself." And he does say with Nicole's permission. He does, which is good. I'm glad that's in there, because if that was not in there, I would be all over this guy.
Yeah.
But I still kind of think, I still get this place where I'm like, is writing this article really what you need to be doing right now? And of course, we get to the meta argument of like, well, if you didn't, Scott, there would be nothing to read and there would be no story. True, but I think the meta nature of this story is part of it. So I think that's worth talking about.
No, I definitely think that a very uncharitable read toward our fictional protagonist's motives is warranted by the way the story is told and so forth. I mean, sorry if I'm reading way too much into one word, but there's a sentence in here where he says, organic memory was what enabled me to construct a whitewashed narrative of my parenting skills. Okay, well, the word whitewashed has very specific connotations. And this is a story where a dude is telling a very fictionalized version of what happened to an African tribe to make a point that he wants to make.
Yeah, that's true.
And the word whitewash is in the story. I'm like, okay, I don't know if I get it, but you're definitely doing something here, Chiang.
Yeah, that's really true. Because I mean, he concludes the account I've given of Tiv is based on fact, but isn't precisely accurate.
Yeah, so it's whitewashed.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
And
again,
I guess good that you admitted that, but still, you've constructed a narrative of a memory in a story about how you realized it was bad to construct a narrative based off of a memory.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like the point of the story is that we're supposed to be scrutinizing
Sure.
his motives and the way he's doing things. So I enjoy doing that anyway.
Sure.
But I definitely think that's part of this story.
I mean, as we were talking about this, I have a bit of it open here, and the way he describes what his colleague does for the article that he was supposed to be working on is just really interesting usage too.
Uh-huh.
She wrote a fine piece about the pros and cons of the software, a dispassionate article free from all the soul searching and angst that would have saturated anything I submitted. And it's this self-deprecating nature while also still being kind of rude at the same time, right? Like you get permission to be rude by being rude to yourself as well. And it's this really kind of shady thing. And I don't think that's the only time he does it in the story. I think he does it multiple times in the story, and that's really interesting. That does, like, it all feels intentional to me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think just to circle back to what you said earlier, like the idea that his wife just left because she was flighty. It's like, I don't know, man, you seem pretty awful.
Right. I want to get to that part because I think it's fascinating how he describes it. Yeah. Okay. Nicole's mother, Angela, declared that she deserved a more interesting life than the one we were giving her, and spent the next decade crisscrossing the globe. I mean, she did leave her daughter behind, so I don't want to build a narrative where her wife did nothing wrong, right? Because his wife did nothing wrong, because obviously she did. But yeah, I mean, like, he describes that in probably the most uncharitable way possible, and we never really get a window into that relationship at all, because he's not interested in telling that story. Right.
I mean, the story surely gives us no motive to forgive Angela or to think that there was any real good motive there, but you're exactly right that, like, the way he phrases this is just the most snark ass possible.
Right.
Like, that's almost certainly not what she said, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah,
like
absolutely.
We know this is his little story that he tells himself, which is what this whole story is about, right? This idea that we have little pat stories we tell ourselves about why certain things happened.
So you would think in a story where he learns that, he would edit out the part where he's snarky as fuck to someone.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that might not be the full story. But no, because he's still mad about it. Yeah. Great. Anything else about that one? I really love both of these stories.
I did too. I mean, I guess the only other note that I had here was, like, both stories use this motif of, like, basically intertwining plots.
Yeah.
And they use them in different ways, but sort of in a similar way where it's almost musical in that, like, they're playing off of each other and being interrelated. So yeah, I loved it. There's one other Ted Chiang story that I have read, and I think it was Heaven is the Absence of God's Love or something like that, or Heaven is the Absence of God, something like that. And I loved that story too. That one's very different than either of these two. I would say these are more similar to each other than they are to that story. But he's a genius. Love him. Recommend these very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I bought the book Stories of Your Life and Others after I watched Arrival. Now I can't find it anymore. The only one I read was Story of Your Life, which was probably bad of me to buy a whole book of short stories and then only read one, even though I loved it. But I got to find it and read the rest of them, because I really enjoyed all these.
Cool.
Doof. All right, that is it for Mr. Chiang. Let's talk about some industry news.
So you got to educate me about what this thing is, because I don't understand.
Okay, so the news item that we're talking about is the Department of Justice announced this week that they are reversing their opinion on the Paramount Consent Decrees. What the Paramount Consent Decrees were basically this system of rules about theater ownership and distribution that happened in the 1940s. I think it was 1948 to be specific, that changed up the studio system, that basically broke up the big studios. And we've lived under these rules ever since. So some of the big ones are the idea that a studio cannot own a movie theater. They wanted to specifically stop vertical integration. So a studio cannot do the production, distribution, and exhibition of a theater of a movie. They didn't want that. Another big one was something called I forgot what is, like, block showings, which are basically back before this, block booking it's called. Back before this, what a studio would say, oh, you want Star Wars? Well, you also have to take this other crappy movie that no one would ever bought to show. And so basically that you forced the theaters to buy all your movies in bulk. You can't get the big one without also taking the little ones. That was bad for business because basically one studio could fill an entire theater with their stuff by block booking and no other studio could. So this has been the existence of the law since the 40s. And this is how the theater system has been run. And the Trump administration's Department of Justice this week, I think a few weeks ago, they said they were looking at doing this. And then they released their opinion a couple days ago that, yes, they are going to reverse these rules. Block booking is one that they're going to slowly phase out over 2 years, but they're basically going to roll back all these restrictions. And their argument for this, Matt, and I think it's a good one, even though I don't agree with it and think it's bad. But their argument is that the theater system has changed so dramatically since 1948 that these rules just don't work anymore. And I think this is true because I think we were talking about this the other day. With streaming services, you're basically vertically integrated. Like, if a streaming platform is as big as a movie theater, you can create, distribute, and exhibit your own stuff. And also there's way more movie theaters now than there was in the 40s. Like, every movie, I think one of the things the DOJ said specifically is there's like towns in the 40s had one movie theater. Towns today have like a shit ton of movie theaters, which isn't entirely true, but that's their argument, right? Their argument is that things have changed, and so we're going to go back on this stuff.
Okay, I don't see it personally. It just seems like things aren't that different. Like you're still just allowing a kind of predatory rent-seeking behavior that has no possible positive consequence. If you roll back these rules, it's like it's just bad for consumers. I don't see how it could possibly be good. Like, is it just, are they just lying, or is there actually some argument that this could be good for consumers in some way?
So let me read what they said, and you can see what your interpretation of this is. First thing is, most metropolitan areas today have more than one movie theater. The first-run movie palaces of the 1930s and 40s that had one screen and showed one movie at a time. Today, they have been replaced by multiplex theaters that have multiple screens showing movies from many different distributors at the same time. Finally, consumers today are no longer limited to watching motion pictures in theaters. New technology has created many different distributions and viewing platforms that did not exist when the decrees were entered into. After an initial theater run, today's consumers can view motion pictures on cable and broadcast television, DVDs, and over the internet through streaming services. So, everything they said there, true, right? The question is, does that being the case mean that these rules are not necessary to prevent anti-competition practices?
I mean, I feel like the first thing that you read was a non sequitur to the second thing, because like if you think about like smaller movies, the fact that multiplexes exist ceases to help smaller movies if Disney can now just block out the entire theater. And the fact that streaming services exist do not really help smaller movies because they do not get the big shot in the arm of potential, really good ticket sales if they happen to be really good and you get a lot of buzz. Right. They're just going on the streaming service. they're just getting whatever you get paid for going on a streaming service. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, I actually have no idea if streaming services pay people more if their movies are watched more. But I mean, if they are, I guess that would be good for them. But
yeah. And I mean, the important part here is that we're already at a crisis moment where the big studios have gotten really big again. For comparison, the 5 biggest studios in the country right now grossed 91% of all box office revenue last year, or this year so far.
So we're already in a highly anti-competitive space, and they're removing
more controls.
Yeah, this sounds pretty bad, honestly. Yeah.
The Disney buying Fox deal was very, very bad. This is worse because this is government sanctioned nonsense. Like, and it's not just Disney. Like, I know we love to blame Disney because they're the biggest problem. They own 30% of the market share by themselves, 31%. But all the big ones want this. And I mean, their argument basically is that, like, the reason why we passed these laws in the first place was because one studio could basically make it so you couldn't see a movie from another studio in your town. You couldn't. They had the power to do that, right? And well, their argument is that's not true anymore with the prevalence of independent movie theaters and the prevalence of streaming and stuff. That's not true anymore. But with all those streaming services still being pay to play, like, they can still prevent you. Like, if Disney, I won't use Disney because everyone uses Disney. If Warner Brothers, after this block booking stuff goes away, releases, I don't know, what does Warner Brothers have? The new Batman movie. And they say to Alamo Drafthouse, which is it's a chain, but it's a smaller chain, right? They usually have about 8 theaters. And they say, if you want Batman, you also have to take these 3 other movies. Right now, that would be illegal. They couldn't do that. Next year, they could do that. And then you take it or you go out of business because you can't not show Batman. You can't.
Yeah. I mean, Alamo Drafthouse is a good example because they would either have to accept a bunch of crappy movies so that they could carry Batman, and then, like, that's or not. And yeah, I mean, exactly what you said, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
I'm just like, I'm straining to see, like, the galaxy brain way in which this is not a disaster, and it just seems like it's just purely bad, and it's going to really damage small theaters and smaller movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
So
yeah,
not happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's bad. It's super, super bad, and that's why we're talking about it here, because I mean, I don't know if there's anything we can do. We can certainly write to our Congress and try to, but this is a posture from the Department of Justice. We can hope that someone will be elected in 2020 that will reverse this decision. But I just, like, all, like, A24 is a studio that has been putting out killer movies. They're tiny, they're small movies. Those get pushed out. Places like Alamo Drafthouse, places like Studio Movie Grill, Landmark Theaters, the small independent theaters, those get pushed out because those are not as diverse as the DOJ thinks, right?
Yeah.
They still are having to compete at the same level as, like, an AMC is, and they can't, especially when we're doing this predatory blocking stuff, especially when fucking Warner Brothers is going to be allowed to buy their own theater chain if they want to.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, this, I got nothing else to say. Like, it just seems like a really obvious anti-competitive, like, practice that they're now making practically mandatory. So
yeah. Now, yeah. For full disclosure, the DOJ has said they're going to continue to monitor this very closely over the next 2 years. So they could monitor it and say, oops, we fucked up, my bad. But as of now, they are relaxing some of this stuff, not all of it, but they're going to closely monitor and pay attention to it. But I don't know. For some reason, I don't have a lot of faith in this administration to really stick by antitrust and anti-competition practices.
Well, and also I don't know how you know that you fucked up before you've already put some studios out of business.
That's true. Yeah.
Looks like Disney's, Warner Brothers, whatever, is doing this block booking thing that they're allowed to do now. Yep. Okay. You knew they were going to do that. So you're obviously not going to act on that knowledge. You're going to wait until something terrible happens to one of these other businesses.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is AMC can survive block booking. Alamo Drafthouse cannot. Yeah. And that's just the fact.
We were having a conversation on the Discord the other day about like how these, there'll be a movie that has like a $90 million budget and it makes $60 million back and it's a huge flop. And there'll be a movie that has a $5 million budget and then it makes $100 million and it's a massive success, and like how wildly unpredictable movie revenues are. I think a lot of studios almost survive on this randomness. Like every once in a while, one movie is going to just kind of weirdly do way better than it should based on its budget and so forth. And if you're basically cutting off the upside in business language by allowing this block booking thing, you're making it much harder for small movies to kind of surprisingly do really well because they're just not going to be in theaters in the first place. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, where does A24 exhibit their movies when AMC is required to show 6 Disney movies, 8 Warner Brothers movies? Like it just there's no, they just get pushed out.
I think all we can like realistically hope is that the big studios understand how bad this would look and they just don't do it.
Yeah, that's how I'm not.
I'm not saying I have faith in that. I'm just saying like that's almost the only path where I can see it not getting really bad.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I didn't mean to end the show on a depressing note, but I was very surprised to see that this was not. And I know there's a lot of shit going on right now. The president is in the middle of an impeachment inquiry, so like there's a lot of shit happening in the news right now. But I was surprised to see how little play the story got, considering how bad it is. It's very bad.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't mean to turn this into politics corner, but like some of my first memories of like politics are of the president being impeached and it being like an obvious, ridiculous, and embarrassing circus. So like the fact that the president is having impeachment hearings, I'm just like, oh, this shit again. But like it has no weight to me, and that's probably just because of like the weird specific age that I am.
Sure.
But I don't know. Just thought that was funny.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think that's all I had. Anything else? You got anything?
No. Go read Ted Chiang.
Yeah, do that. So that's all we have for you guys this week. If you have any opinions on either of those 2 Ted Chiang stories we read, or any of his work, or if you want to talk to us about your thoughts on how the entire film industry is going to come crumbling down thanks to the Department of Justice, you can reach out to us via email at doofmedia@gmail.com or over at our Twitter account at doofmedia.
Yeah, and if you're not already subscribed to this podcast, we encourage you to do so and ensure you never miss an episode. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else podcasts can be found.
And of course, you can find all of our shows over at our website, doofmedia.com. That's where you can find Media MD, who are doing, what are they doing next? New Girl next week. They're going to have an episode that comes out on Thanksgiving Day because they are not American.
Yeah. Thanks for covering our bases there.
Yeah, we really appreciate it because we will be off next week. There will be no Doofcast next week because it will be Thanksgiving. So we're going to be off, taking the week off. On that show, we're still doing our other ones because that's how the week crumbles.
True.
If you like what we do here, if you like Doofcast or Media MD or any of the other shows we produce, you can help support us by becoming a patron of Doof Media. Head on over to patreon.com/doofmedia and pledge $1 a month or whatever else you can afford. Each and every cent that you donate to us goes right back into our company. It keeps the lights on, the electricity running, the internet going, our equipment, and these stories that we read for y'all. This episode here only exists thanks to one of our patrons, Edan M, who was nice enough to donate to us and asked us to read these excellent stories. So thank you, Edan, so much. It had been a while since I've returned to Story of Your Life, and I really love The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling.
Yeah, and of course, I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of dig into it because I always get a lot more out of it when I do that versus just read it and think, oh, yeah, that's pretty good.
100%.
Yeah. Also, please consider rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. Every review helps us get more exposure and introduces new people to the content that we make here.
All right, guys. Once again, we will be off next week, but we will see you in 2 weeks' time to talk about Season 1 of The Legend of Korra.
Water.
Heart. Wait, no, that's wrong.
And you'll do what I say. My name is Doof, and you'll do what I say.